Brilliant. Welcome, everybody, to International House for our annual Frank Larkins Oration and 2026. My name's Dr. Catherine Firth. I'm the interim head here at International House, and it's a pleasure to be standing here and welcoming you, some of whom have been know this event far better than I do. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the University of Melbourne and International House acknowledges the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we work, learn and live, the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people. The University and International House acknowledges and is grateful to the traditional owners, to the elders and knowledge holders of all Indigenous nations and clans who have been instrumental in our reconciliation journey. We recognise the unique place held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the original owners and custodians of the lands and waterways across the Australian continent, with histories of continuous connection dating back more than 60,000 years. We also acknowledge their enduring cultural practices of caring for country. We pay respects to elders past, present and future, and acknowledge the importance of Indigenous knowledge in the Academy. As a community of researchers, teachers, professional staff and students, we are privileged to work and learn every day with Indigenous colleagues and partners. And in making this acknowledgement of country, we commit to respectful and responsible conduct towards all others according to the traditional laws of this land, particularly at times of formal ceremony. Today, we'd like to welcome you to International House. Welcome to Professor Barry Judd. Making sure that I'm making eye contact as I'm welcoming people, to Professor Frank Larkins and to Valerie Larkins, to senior members of the university whose presence is very much felt and welcomed, to members of our advisory group, to former council members, students, staff and long-term IH supporters, to members and leaders of neighbouring colleges and halls, to our current staff and students who are here, and for the first time, to those joining us online. For those of us in the building, a small moment having said welcome, and all of this high stuff from the sublime to the ridiculous, a little housekeeping. If you need the bathroom, just slide out of that door, keep going, don't leave the building, sort of wriggle and you'll get there. All genders, all accessibilities are catered for, and in the case of an emergency, do follow staff instructions. If we have to evacuate, we'll go out the way you came in, back out to Royal Parade. Reading Barry's book last night, I reflected that it asks what might a Western style of enlightened education have to offer people of other cultural backgrounds. We know that it could be used for colonisation, for segregation or oppression, but it could also be used for good, recognising people as fully human, providing agency and opportunities, adding to their worldviews, not replacing them. And that is relevant to us at International House in so many ways. You're all telling me, and I hear it, and we all are listening, at how important the history, the culture, the unique place of International House is and needs to continue to be. International House has always been a place for active anti-racism. And from our earliest days, we understood that this had to include First Nations people. For example, Gordon Santo was the first recorded male Indigenous student at the University of Melbourne. An article from the University of Queensland student newspaper suggests or heavily implies that he was denied entry to UQ before being admitted to the University of Melbourne, and he was a resident here at International House for 2 years between 1959 and 1960, arriving, that is, only 2 years after we opened our doors. Much closer to the present, Flynn Obama Kellenbach was our student club president in 2024 and the recipient of an Indigenous Commonwealth Reward Scholarship from the university. I had invited Flynn to offer the alumni vote of thanks, but I understand he's currently on a van life adventure in the middle of WA. It was a better offer. But ours has often been a quiet welcome, not the Indigenous poster boys of the colleges, as Peter Campbell has described it in his chapter in Volume 1 of Dumbak Gubguana, nor the full-throated advocacy of, say, Lisa Belair, as Barry has described in his chapter in Volume 2 of the same series. And welcome to members of our neighbouring hall, Lisa Belair House, where I am also head. Thank you for coming. Today you will hear from our chair of the advisory group, Mr. Peter Godfrey, from Professor Barry Judd, from former senior student and current International House Advisory Group member Pamela Tam, and of course from you, the audience. We always have a deep, reflective and meaningful question and answer time at the end of the talk, and we very much look forward to your contributions. But now, over to Peter.
Thank you, Catherine, and good evening, and thank you for attending. Good evening to those online as well. A first for us, and hopefully not a last. Since 2011, International House has held the Frank Larkins Oration annually to promote intellectual discourse, particularly in the areas of internationalism and geopolitical analysis, to help understand the changing world. The oration is named in honour of Emeritus Professor Frank Larkins AM, who is here tonight with his wife Valerie, and it's lovely to see you, Valerie, really lovely. Emeritus Professor Frank Larkins came into the House as a chemistry tutor in 1962. Frank went on to a stellar career, including as a Rhodes Scholar, Chief Scientist Energy of Victoria, and at the university he served as Dean of Science, Dean of Land and Food Resources, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research, Deputy Vice-Chancellor International, and Deputy Vice-Chancellor Global Relations. Professor Larkins has retained his connection to the House, including terms as Chair of Council and author of our history. We warmly welcome and acknowledge Frank and Valerie Larkins. Professor Barry Judd is Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous and Professor of Indigenous Studies in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. He serves as a board member of the Museums and Galleries of the Northern Territory and the Life Again Foundation. He is also a member of the Reconciliation Action Plan Committee of the Richmond Football Club. Jane said not to say, "Go Tigers," but I did anyway. Professor Judd's research ranges widely across Indigenous studies, from football to histories of education to tourism and truth-telling. Professor Judd holds several Australian Research Council grants, and with Catherine Ellinghouse, he is the author of the book Enlightened Aboriginal Futures, published by Routledge. Barry's career commenced as a student employment assistant, working with the Koori Student and Liaison Unit, before moving on to academic and senior leadership roles at Melbourne, Monash, RMIT and Charles Darwin universities. The story that Barry tells from his time at the Koori Student and Liaison Unit brings together both his memories of Lisa Belair and of the Rotary Club, and is relevant to this audience. Now I'm going to digress a little bit in that Lisa Belair House, and Catherine has acknowledged that she's head and acknowledged there are members of staff from Lisa Belair House. But when Jane and I were in college, it was Lennon's, and I'm sure a few of you have been to that watering hole, but it was probably the first time I actually met and acknowledged Jane. We lived in college together, and some 50 years later, here we are still. Okay, Lisa Belair House. The story from Barry, I quote, "Among the many things I learnt from working closely with Lisa Belair was the need to reach out and engage with people from all walks of life. Using her sense of irony and good humour, Lisa often disarmed awkward situations to win over people in ways that made constructive conversations and meetings possible. Her abilities were perhaps best showcased when Lisa and I visited Rotary clubs across Victoria to promote Indigenous activity at the university. in the hope that Rotarians might provide philanthropic support to targeted Indigenous scholarships. I was very likely involved in this work only because I had a driver's licence, and Lisa did not. Our hosts were well-meaning and welcoming, but the formalities of Rotary in Australia were not always congenial to me. Toasting the Queen was something that I found difficult. I indicated to Lisa that I did not want to do it, seeing it as a small act of resistance. But Lisa countered that not toasting the Queen would be to disrespect an elder. I could not argue with that. On that note, would you please welcome Professor Barry Judd to present the 2016 International House Frank Larkins Oration.
Wow, that was quite an introduction, wasn't it? Thanks for having me. I too would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional owners of Naarm. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present and future. To any Aboriginal people here, aside from me, I would also like to acknowledge Professor Frank Larkins and his wife in attendance this evening. It is a profound privilege to deliver an oration bearing Frank's name. Frank's decades of service transformed this university into an institution that looks confidently outward to the world, to new ideas, and to the relationships that make intellectual life possible. It is fitting that this lecture occurs at International House. This place embodies a simple but profound idea that bringing people together across cultures, languages and faiths is in itself an educational endeavour. Education happens not only in lecture theatres, but in conversations, in shared experiences, and in the daily challenge of learning to live well with people whose backgrounds differ from our own. Belonging is ultimately about relationship. It emerges through our connections with place, with history, with knowledge, and with one another. To belong in Australia requires understanding of Indigenous Australia. It requires recognition that this continent's story did not begin with British settlement. It began thousands of generations earlier, and those histories continue to shape contemporary Australia profoundly. My argument tonight is very straightforward. Meaningful futures are built through relationships. They are built through curiosity, dialogue, and trust. They are built through a willingness not merely to coexist, but to learn from one another. They require something more, the courage to encounter difference with open hearts and open minds. The title of this lecture is drawn from a book I co-authored with Kat Allinghouse, Enlightened Aboriginal Futures. At its heart, the book asks a fundamental question: who gets to participate in creating the future? For much of Australian history, Aboriginal people have appeared as the objects of policy rather than as active participants in history. While these policies undoubtedly shaped Aboriginal lives, such narratives risk obscuring something equally important: the capacity of Aboriginal people to make decisions, pursue aspirations, and shape the worlds in which they lived. It's the problem of wearing multifocal glasses. You're never quite sure where things are. Our research examined the history of the Finke River Mission, FRM, a mission headquartered at Hermannsburg in Central Australia. The community became a place where different worlds encountered one another: Aboriginal traditions, Lutheran Christianity, colonial government, and emerging forms of education and employment. One prominent figure in this story was F.W. Albrecht, a Lutheran missionary who developed a scheme specifically focused on educating Aboriginal girls, remarkable for its time. In the mid-20th century, when educational opportunities for Aboriginal people in Central Australia were severely limited, Albrecht's commitment to girls' education represented a deliberate and progressive choice. Albrecht's scheme relied on consent and respect for the autonomy of individuals, and therefore stood in stark contrast to the forced removal of children and propagation of the stolen generations as a cost of formal education, economic opportunity, and civic and political rights and freedoms. Yet the crucial question is not what Albrecht imagined for Aboriginal people. The more important question is what Aboriginal people themselves did with the opportunities and constraints that surrounded them. When we examined mission records, community histories, and oral traditions, what emerged was not a picture of passivity, it was a picture of people actively engaging with change. Aboriginal families made strategic decisions about which girls would attend school and what they would learn. They weighed the benefits of education against the demands of maintaining traditional responsibilities and kinship obligations. The girls themselves demonstrated remarkable agency. They learned new skills while maintaining their connections to Aboriginal knowledge systems. They acquired literacy in English while continuing to speak their own languages. They engaged with Christian teachings while drawing upon older religious traditions written in country. They navigated the complexities of boarding school while remaining grounded in their identities. What we see is neither wholesale acceptance nor straightforward resistance. We see negotiation, we see adaptation, we see agency. This is the first crucial insight. Aboriginal people did not retreat into certainty when faced with difference. They stepped towards it. They encountered new ideas and new opportunities with open minds. They asked, how can we learn from this? How can we use this to strengthen our communities? How can we remain who we are while engaging with what is new? The girls who participated in Albrecht's education scheme became teachers, nurses, language translators, writers, and community leaders. They used their education to support their families and maintain cultural practices. This demonstrates that Aboriginal people were not passive recipients of education. They were active participants in deciding how education would serve their own aspirations and their communities' futures. The most important story is not what others imagined for Aboriginal people, it is what Aboriginal people imagined for themselves. And they imagined futures built through relationships. Relationships between old knowledge and new knowledge, between family obligations and individual opportunity, between tradition and change. The history of Lutheran mission in Central Australia reminds us that human communities are not passive recipients of change. They respond to new circumstances with creativity, and they respond to new circumstances strategically. Many programs established by the mission were intended to prepare Aboriginal people for participation in what missionaries regarded as a modern future. Yet Aboriginal people did not engage with these opportunities in the ways that missionaries necessarily expected. They interpreted them through their own priorities and responsibilities. What emerges is not a simple story of cultural replacement, Rather, it is a story of negotiated futures. And by negotiated futures, I mean futures that are created through ongoing engagement with changing circumstances rather than imposed by any single institution or ideology. Aboriginal people in relationship with the Finke River Mission did not simply accept or reject modernity, they negotiated with it. They adapted aspects of it to their own circumstances. They found ways to incorporate new opportunities into existing relationships and obligations. This is the second crucial insight. Meaningful change requires relationship. It requires people to remain in conversation despite disagreement. It requires the willingness to listen, to understand, and to adapt. The Aboriginal future in Central Australia was not created by policies alone. It was not created by missionary intentions alone. It was created through relationships between people, through ongoing negotiation, and through the willingness of individuals and communities to engage with one another over time. And I've often described the relationship between the mission and Aboriginal people in Central Australia as being something of a marriage. There's an ongoing commitment. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not, but people stay together. And that's very different to what we have seen, particularly since the late 1960s, with government interventions in Central Australia. Cultural continuity and innovation are not opposites. People are capable of carrying multiple traditions simultaneously. They can engage with new technologies, new knowledge systems, and new institutions while maintaining continuity with the relationships and values that have shaped their lives. This capacity for adaptation is not evidence of cultural weakness, it is evidence of cultural resilience. The future emerges through an ongoing conversation between inheritance and possibility. People draw upon knowledge, values, and relationships they have inherited and use them as resources for navigating new circumstances. This is what it means to encounter difference with an open heart and an open mind. It is not about abandoning who you are, it is about remaining grounded while being open to change and newness. And it is a lesson about relationships that speaks most directly to the contemporary university. For if education is ultimately concerned with the creation of futures, then universities must ask not only what knowledge they transmit, but also what kinds of relationships they foster and what possibilities those relationships make available. If there is one lesson I take from the history of the Finke River Mission, it is this: at the heart of every mission, every school, every policy, and every attempt at social change were relationships between people. What struck me as I worked through the archives was that the history of Lutheran mission could not be reduced to simple categories of success or failure. Many of the most significant outcomes emerged not from formal policies, but from sustained engagement over time. Trust, where it developed, was not created through declarations or institutional plans. It emerged gradually. It was built through presence, through listening, through the accumulation of shared experience, and through the often difficult work of remaining in conversation despite disagreement, despite misunderstanding, etc., etc. It strikes me as an important lesson for our own time. Contemporary institutions, including universities, often operate within short-term cycles. Governments work to electoral timetables. Funding programs are established and dismantled. Michael's smiling. Strategic priorities shift, leaders come and go. Yet many of the things that matter most resist this kind of timetabling. Trust takes time, understanding takes time, relationships take time. This is particularly true when we think about relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. There is often a temptation to search for technical solutions to deeply relational challenges. We can become preoccupied with programs, structures or policies and overlook the fact that meaningful change ultimately depends upon people learning to engage with one another in different ways. The history of the Finke River mission suggests that lasting futures are not created through transactions. They are created through relationships. Transactions are temporary. They achieve a particular outcome and then conclude. Relationships are different. They require reciprocity. They require continuity. They require a willingness to remain engaged even when the outcome is uncertain. They require the courage to remain open to being changed by the encounter. At its best, education operates in this way. Education is not merely the transfer of information from one person to another. It is a relationship between learners and teachers, between ideas and experience, between individuals and communities. The most important learning often occurs not when information is delivered, but when genuine engagement takes place. This has, I think, profound implications for the contemporary university. Universities create value because they create relationships between people and ideas, sometimes even between disciplines, between communities and institutions, and between different ways of understanding the world. The deeper question is what kinds of relationships universities foster, what kinds of conversations they enable, and what possibilities those relationships and conversations make available. For the University of Melbourne, that question has become increasingly significant in the context of Indigenous engagement. What does it mean to build relationships that move beyond symbolic recognition? What does it mean to create genuine dialogue between Indigenous and non-Indigenous knowledge traditions? How do universities become places where different histories, perspectives and experiences can encounter one another in ways that deepen understanding? If relationship is the enduring lesson of history, then one of the most important questions facing contemporary universities is how those relationships are built and sustained. Truth-telling provides a way forward because at its heart, truth-telling is about relationship. Healthy relationships depend upon honesty. Families cannot flourish without honesty. Friendships cannot flourish without honesty. Communities cannot flourish without honesty. The same is true of nations, and I think it is equally true of universities. Truth-telling is not primarily about the past. It is about creating the conditions necessary for trust. It is about ensuring that the stories people tell about themselves, their institutions and their societies are sufficiently honest to sustain meaningful relationships in the present and in the future. This is particularly important in Australia because the histories that have shaped Indigenous and non-Indigenous relationships continue to influence contemporary life. The effects of dispossession, exclusion, and unequal access to opportunity did not simply disappear because the formal policies that created them changed. Histories live on through institutions, social structures, and inherited assumptions. Truth-telling, in this sense, is a deeply optimistic project. It begins from the assumption that greater understanding is possible. It assumes that people can confront complexity without retreating into defensiveness. It rests on the belief that honest conversations can strengthen relationships rather than weaken them. It requires the courage to encounter difficult histories with open hearts and open minds. Universities are among the few institutions in society specifically designed to pursue difficult questions. At their best, they are places where difficult conversations can occur with both rigour and respect. Truth-telling requires more than simply presenting information. Facts alone rarely change relationships. What matters is how people engage with those facts. Genuine understanding emerges through genuine dialogue. For that reason, truth-telling and dialogue are inseparable. Honest accounts of the past create opportunities for meaningful conversation, while meaningful conversation enables people to understand why those histories matter in the first place. The most compelling dimension of the university's Indigenous strategy is that it invites us to think beyond inclusion alone. The deeper challenge is intellectual. It requires us to ask what changes when Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous perspectives, and Indigenous histories become part of the way the university understands itself. At its best, the strategy is a statement about the kind of institution the university aspires to be. It envisages a university capable of building meaningful relationships with Indigenous communities, capable of engaging honestly with history, and capable of learning from different knowledge traditions. Most importantly, it imagines a university confident enough to be changed by those relationships, a university willing to encounter difference with open hearts and open minds. If Indigenous strategy is ultimately about intellectual transformation, then we must ask, what difference does Indigenous knowledge make to the intellectual life of the university? The answer is that Indigenous knowledge does not merely diversify the university, it strengthens it. Indigenous knowledge introduces new questions, new methodologies, and new ways of understanding relationships between people, communities, and environments. It challenges assumptions that have become so familiar they are often invisible. It enriches intellectual inquiry itself. At the University of Melbourne, we can see this clearly in environmental research. For many decades, Australian environmental management operated according to assumptions inherited largely from European traditions of conservation. Landscapes were often understood as natural environments that should be protected from human intervention. Indigenous knowledges complicated that picture. Research led by scholars such as Michael Sean Fletcher, working alongside Indigenous knowledge holders and communities, has demonstrated that many Australian landscapes were actively managed through sophisticated forms of cultural burning developed over thousands of years. The significance of this research extends beyond environmental management. It demonstrates how Indigenous knowledge can fundamentally reshape the questions researchers ask. These examples challenge a persistent misconception, the assumption that Indigenous knowledge and academic excellence are separate pursuits. In reality, Indigenous knowledge is a form of excellence. It reflects sustained observation, intellectual rigour, adaptability, and deep engagement with complex systems. Like all knowledge traditions, it is developed through generations of inquiry, testing, refinement, and transmission. It represents not only cultural heritage, but intellectual achievement. We see the same dynamic in the work of Professor Dwayne Harmicker and his research on Indigenous astronomy and sky country. And we also witness the transformative power of Indigenous knowledge through the university's commitment to truth-telling and dialogue. The publication of Dumbak Gubgubwana, A History of Indigenous Australia and the University of Melbourne, challenged the university to engage more honestly with its own history and its relationship with Indigenous peoples. More recently, the appointment of Travis Lovett, former Yurok Justice Commissioner, as Executive Director of the Centre for Truth-Telling and Dialogue, reflects a continuing commitment to create spaces where Indigenous knowledge, truth-telling and public conversation can shape how we understand both our past and our future. Together, these examples challenge a persistent misconception that excellence and Indigenous matters are in opposition to each other. Complex problems are rarely solved through a single perspective. The most productive intellectual environments are those in which different traditions of thought are brought together in dialogue with one another. Progress emerges not through uniformity, but through conversation. This is what it means to encounter difference with an open mind. It is to recognise that excellence emerges not from certainty, but from the willingness to learn from perspectives but beyond our own. In this sense, Indigenous knowledge contributes not simply to diversity but to excellence itself. The strongest universities are those capable of learning from multiple traditions of knowledge and remaining open to intellectual perspectives beyond their own familiar frameworks. The ideas I have been discussing, agency, relationship, dialogue, truth-telling, and intellectual transformation, speak directly to the place in which we are gathered tonight. There are a few places within the University of Melbourne where these themes converge more naturally than at International House. International House was founded on a profound idea that living together across difference is itself educational. It recognised that some of the most important learning in a university does not occur in formal classrooms. It occurs in conversations over meals, in friendships that cross national and cultural boundaries, and in the gradual process through which people learn to see the world through perspectives other than their own. That vision remains as relevant today as it was when International House was established. Universities are among the few institutions in contemporary society that continue to bring together large numbers of people from profoundly different backgrounds and ask them to engage in a shared intellectual enterprise. Yet it is precisely this process that makes universities so valuable. The purpose of higher education is not simply to provide technical expertise. At its best, education expands our capacity to understand complexities. It cultivates intellectual curiosity, empathy and judgment. In short, it prepares us not merely for employment, this may be controversial, but for citizenship in an increasingly interconnected and complex world. I see a deep connection between International House and the university's Indigenous strategy. Yet both are animated by a remarkably similar conviction that learning occurs through engagement across difference. Both recognise that understanding emerges through relationship. Both invite people to move beyond what is familiar and comfortable. Both require the courage to encounter difference with open hearts and open minds. For international students to study in Australia is not to simply study in another country. It is also to study on Indigenous land. It is to live and learn within a society whose history has been profoundly shaped by the relationships between First Peoples, colonial institutions, and successive generations of migrants. Understanding that history does not diminish the international student experience, it enhances it. One of the distinctive opportunities presented by studying in Australia is the chance to encounter one of the oldest continuing knowledge traditions in the world. Indigenous histories, languages, philosophies, and ways of understanding place offer insights that cannot be found elsewhere. In this sense, International House offers a model for the kind of university community we might aspire to build more broadly. It demonstrates that diversity is not simply about representation, it is about relationship. It is about creating environments in which people from different backgrounds can learn with and from one another. It is about recognising that difference, while sometimes challenging, can also be one of the richest sources of intellectual and personal growth. As I end, I want to return to where I began, to the question of belonging and to the significance of relationship. Throughout this lecture, oration, I've spoken about Aboriginal futures, about education, about missions, universities, truth-telling, Indigenous knowledge, and International House. Yet beneath each of these themes lies a common idea. Meaningful futures are built through relationships. The history explored in Enlightened Aboriginal Futures reminds us that Aboriginal people have never been passive recipients of change. Across generations, they have drawn upon knowledge, culture, and relationships to navigate profound social transformations while maintaining continuity with country and community. It reminds us that resilience is not the absence of change. It is the capacity to remain grounded while adapting to new circumstances. It reminds us that the future is not something that happens to us, it is something we build together. The Aboriginal girls who attended Albrecht School did not tread into certainty when faced with difference. They stepped towards it. They learned new skills while maintaining their connections to older knowledge systems. They negotiated between worlds. They encountered difference with open hearts and open minds. That is a model we all must follow now, not the model of those who impose change from above, but the model of those who navigated change from within, who remained grounded while remaining open, who built futures through relationships rather than through mere transactions. This is why the university's Indigenous strategy matters so deeply. At its best, it is about helping the university become more thoughtful, more truthful, and more intellectually ambitious. It is about a university willing to encounter difference with open hearts and open minds. I think the same principle lies at the heart of International House. The enduring value of this institution is not simply that it brings people together from different countries. Its value lies in what happens when those people choose to engage with one another. Australia's future will not be determined solely by economic performance or technological innovation. It will also be shaped by the quality of the relationships we are able to build with one another. It will depend upon our capacity to engage honestly with history, to learn from different traditions of knowledge, and to engage institutions capable of bringing people together rather than driving them apart. That work begins with dialogue. Dialogue is not agreement. Rather, it is the willingness to remain in conversation despite disagreement. It is the recognition that understanding often emerges not only when differences disappear, but when people learn to engage those differences thoughtfully and respectfully. Yet intellectual openness alone is not enough. If there is one final lesson I would like to leave you with this evening, it is that the future requires not only open minds, but also open hearts. Open minds allow us to question assumptions and remain willing to learn, but open hearts make empathy possible. They enable us to listen carefully to experiences different from our own. They encourage humility in the face of complexity. They remind us that understanding is not only an intellectual achievement, but also a human one. The relationships that matter most are rarely built through argument alone. They are built through generosity, through respect, through patience, through the willingness to remain engaged even when conversations become difficult and seemingly impossible. The future is not created by people who retreat into certainty. It is created by people who step forward towards one another, people willing to remain curious, people willing to listen, people willing to imagine possibilities beyond the boundaries of their own experiences, people willing to encounter difference with open hearts and open minds. That is the promise of education. It is the promise of International House. It is the promise of the university's Indigenous strategy. And it is the promise that emerges whenever people from different backgrounds, histories and traditions come together in good faith to learn from one another. If we can sustain that spirit, then the differences that so often divide us can instead become sources of creativity, insight and possibility. The past need not be a burden that confines us. Instead, it can become a source of wisdom and understanding and a foundation upon which we build something better. A university that is more truthful, a society that is more generous, and a future shaped not by fear or division, but by relationships, dialogue, understanding and hope. And in doing so, we move together from past to possibility. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech. You don't get to sit down yet because we're about to do...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Questions.
Questions. It's question time. Friends, who has a question? Oh, and technology people. Carl has the microphone. Look to Carl. If you've got a question, raise your hand. Carl will come over so that everybody can hear you. She says, making... Perfect. Raise your hand. Michael. Thank you.
Barry, thanks very much for that. That was fascinating. I was really struck by early on in your lecture when you talked about the young women who stepped forward into uncertainty. I'd just like you to reflect on, so we're all facing an incredibly uncertain future. I'm thinking of just the change that technology is throwing at us, irrespective of all of the other aspects of change that are occurring. What can our society more broadly learn from that kind of Indigenous culture of stepping forward into uncertainty and leaning in. What's the way that we can learn about how to deal with the uncertainty coming our way?
That was a nice easy one.
Yeah, it's I'm not sure how to answer that, Michael, but one of the young girls was my mother, and several others were people I variously call grandmother and aunt. And I guess one lesson of their lives is don't be so scared and afraid. And I think they must have been, but they continued to go forward, and we can have arguments, historical arguments about, well, what choice did they have in those situations during the 1950s and 60s, but I think they were very courageous in stepping forward into the unknown, and they would argue as a group of people today that they're grateful that they did step forward into those challenges, because many of the people in Central Australia who didn't step forward into boarding school passed away a long time ago, and many of this group are living into their late 70s, 80s and on. So I think the message for me, I think, is be courageous, be less scared about life, and by stepping into the unknown, yes, we're going to make mistakes, but we're also going to learn and grow through that process. I think if I can put it another way, one of the frustrations of being Indigenous in this country is that many of our non-Indigenous community don't step into that difference often and expect Indigenous people or people from non-Anglo backgrounds to make all the concessions and step into the difference. It'd be great as a society if we could see more people stepping into the difference and learning from the great diversity we have in Australia. It's one of our strengths. I mean, I'm talking to the converted here, but it worries me, the direction of the country. Talk of monoculture. Did we ever have one? No. Why would we want one? Because it would be a significant backward step for the country to go back to that kind of imagined 1950s period when the diversity was here but not spoken about and not embraced in the way it became after the 1960s. I didn't answer your question, but...
No, that was great. Who else can I encourage to speak? Thank you.
Thanks for a great speech.
Yeah, no, you're all good.
Yep.
Perfect.
I want to actually acknowledge your opening question, which I thought was a great question, which is what can we learn from, and then something Aboriginal. My question is, it seems to me a lot of what we have learned from Aboriginal culture has been in the sciences and in things like, you know, birding and animals and food and various things like that. But listening to your lecture, I think the thing that you were saying, pretty residue now, that we could learn is ways of being relational. And I'm wondering if you could explore that topic as to how perhaps we could learn that.
Sure. So often you have to go overseas to hear people appreciate the great philosophical traditions of this continent. And recently I attended a workshop at Hokkaido in Japan, and Professor Chris Gosden from Oxford University was the keynote. And he was talking about the difference between modern global society, which is transactional. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of relationships across our lives. They're transactions, though. We go into the bank and we talk to a teller, or we go to a shop and we buy a sandwich, and the transaction's done and dusted. It's a surface, limited type relationship that may only last a few seconds. In contrast, Indigenous societies had limited spans of relationships, but those relationships were high quality relationships. They had real depth, and they were genuine, and they lasted years, if not lifetimes. He made that general comment about Indigenous societies globally, and then referenced Australia as a place where if you wanted to learn about philosophical tradition, you would learn about the philosophical traditions of Indigenous Australia. And that's interesting because inside of Australia, those traditions are called spirituality or something else, or they're contained and limited to exhibitions in art galleries. So there's a whole lot of philosophical morality, ethics, principles to be learnt through the dreaming stories, Jukuba, in my mother's language, of Indigenous people on this continent. A lot of those stories actually reference proper relationships. And I guess one of the examples that many of you might know, because it is something that has toured Australia through the art circuit, would be the Seven Sisters Dreaming story, which is a transcontinental story. It's thought of in Australia as art producing, spirituality. Some people might think of it as a religious story, but not much is done to enact what that story contains. And that story is actually about how men should treat women properly. So it's about proper relationships between men and women. It's really a tale that tells men that they need to do better, and we probably do. But that's not taken up anywhere in Australia as something that could be useful in contemporary society. I've actually just started a ARC-funded project on leadership, which is a linkage grant working with a number of external partners. And that project is really testing the appetite from corporate Australia in terms of how we might take some Indigenous principles and apply them into corporate leadership training days and programs. So my idea would be something like the Seven Sisters could be incorporated into a program for a corporate where we talk about improving gender relationships in the workplace between men and women. So there's a whole lot of stuff there that isn't activated. We need to activate it.
Beautiful. We are officially at time, but if we have one more quick question. Eugenie has her hand up. I think Eugenie wins the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. It's a very quick question. My workplace has a monthly town hall and invites various staff to volunteer to give an acknowledgement of country from the heart, not using the standard wording, I begin by acknowledging the traditionalness. It asks us to say something more, and I wonder if you have any advice or suggestions for people from a non-Indigenous background, but from a culturally and linguistically diverse background like myself, to say appropriate words and make it meaningful for the audience?
If it's read from a script, don't do it. And I think often in life you have to do your homework. So I would encourage people who don't know to start doing some homework around the places in which you live and work. I think that's the best way to acknowledge the traditional owners of any place. And it's something that I guess the university as an institution has started to do through its truth-telling work, but it's always a work in progress. But you have to start somewhere. So I often say to people from different backgrounds who have maybe never thought about Indigenous people before, start with something really easy that you can download from the ABC or the SBS, something like the First Australians program. Watch a couple of episodes of that might be relevant to you and take it from there, really.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the question. You don't get to sit down yet either, because you're about to have a word of thanks, and Pamela will be saying a word of thanks from our alumni and presenting you with a gift.
Okay.
Hello everyone, good evening. My name is Pam. I'm part of the IH advisory group and also was president of student council, just to explain like what I'm doing here and why me. And I just wanted to offer a few quick reflections on what Professor Judd was sharing. And I'd also like to offer my acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the lands that I am standing on today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, as well as Aboriginal people in the audience, including Professor Judd. Can you hear my voice? Like, I'm nervous because actually I wanted to touch on that directly.
We're all nervous.
I hope I didn't cause that. But like, touching on Eugenie's question, as an international student coming to Australia, navigating multiple layers of newness, coming to International House was such a wonderful place to like get to know Australia and Australians. And I ended up marrying one of them, and my 3 children are Australian. And so I think when I think about like creating the future meaningfully, I think about my kids. I think about what International House has to offer in terms of preparing and supporting international students and the Australian students here together to like work together towards creating meaningful futures that engage with Indigenous culture and history. And I was trying to investigate like my own nervousness because in my work I actually have the privilege of working closely with the founders of the National Indigenous Youth Education Coalition, Hayley and Renee. And I've learned so much from them, had so many conversations with them. Like, if anything, I'm kind of well-placed like to engage in conversation and dialogue in these issues, but yet that nervousness remains. And it comes from like something like I call the like FOMO, but not FOMO. It's FOPMIFM, which is the fear of putting my foot in my mouth. And it comes from a place of deep respect for the sheer like cultural and intellectual and historical and emotional enormity of all of it. That I kind of had to figure out myself as I entered the workforce in Australia after leaving International House, because I guess it's a reflection of the time when I was there, maybe 2009 when I was president. There wasn't that much of a focus or dialogue about engagement with anything First Nations related, other than maybe the occasional acknowledgement. And so my deep hope is that if International House going forward, like we can be so intentional about creating this engagement to help, because it's a deep-seated nervousness, like, because it's difficult and there's many challenging things. Then also you are a visitor, so you don't want to, you just want to do this right. And so as we go into the future, like, International House supporting that intentional engagement, and so that our young people emerging from International House, whether from international or Australian students, can go forward and create those meaningful futures and engage with that comfort and that courage that comes from, of course we're doing this. We're well set up to do this. In fact, if anything, International House graduates are some of the best people set up to do this dialogue, to do this learning together. So, sorry to ramble on, but thank you very, very much for being here, and thank you for sharing with us your knowledge.
Thank you.
You are allowed to sit down. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Barry. Thank you to Pam. Thank you to everybody who asked beautiful questions. Thank you to those who are with us online at this moment, and for those of you who are watching later. Thank you to everybody in the room. Thank you for your support, for your emails, for your phone calls, for your visits, for your reminders of what it is that we need to be doing as we hold strong. We look forward to seeing you again soon. You're welcome to move out. The doors will be open. If you've got any questions, please do let us know. And otherwise, have a lovely evening, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Oh, and Carl will tell me off if I don't say, connect with us on LinkedIn if you'd like to stay in the loop.